Okay, for those of you that have joined us, just give us 1 minute. We're going to start shortly, so sit back and we'll get started. Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started here. So thanks for coming out tonight and watching our program. I'm Derek, one of the reference librarians here at the Hudson Library, and I'll also be in conversation with our author here. So just a few little bookkeeping things, and then I'll introduce the author. We have a couple programs you may be interested in. We have on February 23rd, we have on 7 p.m., the lawyer Christopher Gorham, and he's going to be talking about The Confidants, the untold story of the women who helped win World War II and shape modern America. Then on Monday, February 27th at 7 p.m., we have journalist Nicole Pelruth, and she's going to be talking about This Is How They Tell Me the World Ends, the Cyber Weapons Arm Race. And finally, Wednesday, March 1st at 7 p.m., we have Patrick Bringley, and he's going to be talking about All the Beauty in the World, the Metropolitan Museum of Art and Me. So if you're interested in any of these programs, go to hudsonlibrary.org to sign up. We'd like to thank the Learned Owl, who is our local bookseller, to have copies of this wonderful book, Fragile Cargo, which just came out on Valentine's Day, believe it or not. So it's not even quite a week old yet. But if you'd like to purchase that, at the left-hand side or the right-hand side, excuse me, there'll be a link to buy this and you can purchase it. Also, we will have time at the very end for questions. So if you do have questions, there's a little Q&A thing at the bottom. So go ahead and click on that and ask some questions. So let's introduce the author. So tonight we have with us Adam Brookes. He was born in Canada and grew up in the United Kingdom, and he studied Chinese at SOAS, the University of London. He's a journalist for BBC News, working as a correspondent in Beijing, as well as Indonesia and Washington, D.C. Along the way, he reported from some 30 countries, including Iraq, Afghanistan, North Korea, Mongolia, for the BBC television and radio. Is the author of multiple spy novels that are thrillers called Night Heron, Spy Games, and Spy Daughter. As I mentioned, this is his newest book, Fragile Cargo, which came out last week. And he's coming to us from Maryland. So welcome. Thanks for coming here, Adam, tonight.
Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you, everybody, for turning out. Yeah.
So let's kind of set the stage here for some people here. So your book, Fragile Cargo, the actual title is The World War II Race to Save the Treasures of China's Forbidden City. So the book kind of starts in the 1920s. So for those of you out there maybe that don't really have a grasp on, say, China during World War II, can you maybe, Adam, talk a little bit about why Japan invaded China during World War II, and maybe just briefly talk about the background struggle between, say, Chiang Kai-shek and maybe the communists during that time period?
Yeah, absolutely. So, so imperial China, it used to be an empire. It was ruled by emperors for 2 millennia. And in 1911, 1912, the Chinese empire, the Chinese monarchy came to an end, and China became a young, fragile republic. It was a place ruled by regional warlords and strong men. It had a very weak central government, and that's the Republic of China. And the top guy in the Republic of China after 1927 or so was Chiang Kai-shek, this strange sort of ascetic Christian Chinese soldier. And he tried to build the Republic of China into something modern. There was this extraordinary effort from about 1916, 17 onwards to modernize and to take China from being an empire into being a modern nation state. And the story that we're telling in this book, Fragile Cargo, is very much associated with that idea of China becoming a nation state, a unitary nation state with people with a shared national identity and a shared history. Whereas previously, when China had been an empire, God, none of those things were there. And then in the 1930s, the story completely changes because Japan, imperial Japan, is setting its eyes on all of East Asia. And the Japanese had decided, they had persuaded themselves that they were the true masters of Asia, that they were going to kick out the Western imperialists, the Western colonialists, and they were going to create a new Japanese empire. They didn't call it that. They called it something else entirely different. They called it the Asian co-prosperity sphere, but it was an empire. And from the early 1930s onwards, Japan began kind of gobbling up bits of Chinese territory, and Japanese troops were on Chinese soil and were slowly moving into China. And then from 1937 onwards, it was all-out war. And if you speak to an American, they'll normally tell you that, you know, World War II began for us in 1941 after Pearl Harbor. If you speak to a Brit, they'll say, no, it began in 1939 with Germany's invaded Poland. Talk to a Chinese person, they'll tell you, well, 1937 is when World War II began for us. And in fact, some historians say that World War II began in 1931. Way back when the Japanese first moved into Chinese territory. So that gives you a sense of what's going on. But, you know, China was very chaotic, and it was under the whip, not just from the Western powers, but also from the Japanese throughout the 1930s. And the sort of chaos and brutality and unpredictability of that time is the backdrop for this story, Fragile Cargo, about the imperial art collections.
Okay, great. So the story really starts to take shape in the 1920s, and I found it very interesting is there was this thing called the Palace Museum, the Forbidden City, and it was kind of open to the public, and it was one of those things where you think about it, it was very sacred to the Chinese people, and there was a decision to kind of open it and show the items off. Why did the Chinese people wanted to do that? What was the decision behind that?
Right. So the Forbidden City, you know, we've all seen those images of the Forbidden City in central Beijing with those huge red walls and those yellow tiles on the roofs. That was the home of emperors from the 15th century onwards. For 600 years, China's emperors of the Ming and Qing empires lived in the Forbidden City. And they had this colossal art collection in there. And the last emperor was, after the collapse of the Chinese empire, the Qing empire, the last emperor was kicked out in 1924. And at that time, they didn't know what to do with this vast art collection and these palaces and these enormous places and the whole kind of residue of Chinese empire. They didn't know what to do with it. So they decided they would bring in a load of professors and students, and they would go into these empty, dark, echoing palaces, and they would start itemizing. They would start cataloging every single thing that they found in there. And through 1924, 1925, these inventory teams cataloged 1.17 million items. I've got a couple of images here that I can, if you just bear with me for a second, I can show you. Here we go. Back here is an image of the Forbidden City. That's the southern entrance to the Forbidden City in 1900. That's the home of the Chinese emperors. That's called the Meridian Gate. Look at the state of it. It's completely broken down. Look at the weeds growing everywhere. Look at the chunks falling off the roofs, and it's, you know, it's in a terrible state by this time. The mid-1920s, the last emperor's gone, and these inventory teams go in and they start cataloging all this art. And that's sort of what it looked like. That's one of the only images we have of that process. These inventory teams sorting their way through mountains and mountains of documents and calligraphy and paintings and carvings in jade and jewelry and furs and, you know, bronzes and this colossal collections of art. And this was the first time much of this stuff had ever been seen, because the art collections were secret up until that point. The Chinese emperors never allowed the public in. But by 1925, the entire Forbidden City has become a museum, and it's been opened to the public. And this is part of this modernization process. China's trying to have a great big museum that can rival the Louvre in Paris or the British Museum. And it wants this great big cultural institution for itself. So that gives you some sense of what was going on here. And through the 1920s, the Palace Museum, as it's now called, sort of flourishes. It does pretty well. It does okay. And the guy who's in charge of it is this guy. He's called Ma Heng. And he takes over, he's got a senior position in the museum, and he takes over as director in the early 1930s. And he is central to this whole story. He's a scholar, he's quite a wealthy man. He's instrumental in setting up archaeology, modern archaeology in China. He's a very quiet, retiring man. He liked a Western suit. He loved to smoke a cigar. And when he and the other curators went into the Forbidden City in the 1920s, they found all this incredible art, paintings like this that I'm showing you now. This is a painting called Early Snow on the River. It was painted about 1100 years ago when China was split apart into lots and lots of little kingdoms. And it's this fantastic hand scroll. It goes on for yards and meters, yards and yards. And this is just a detail from it. And it's a picture of fishermen on a river, painted purely with brush and ink and a little pigment. And it's this extraordinary image and study of life in 10th century China, and how fishermen lived and how they fished. You could see the fishing apparatus and everything they did. And paintings like this had never been seen before. They'd lived in this mysterious secret hoard in the Palace Museum. Another wonderful nature painting, painted around the same time, just observing deer and flowers and foliage and trees. This is a painting called A Herd of Deer in an Autumn Grove. They found all this incredible porcelain. This piece, the red glaze on this piece is vanishingly rare. It's a copper red glaze from the Ming Dynasty that is almost impossible to achieve. It's incredibly hard to make this glaze. And for every successful piece that they fired in the kiln, hundreds or thousands would fail, and they would throw them away and smash them. This is from about 1420, something like that. Vanishingly rare, fantastically valuable. These pieces now on the international art market sell for millions and millions of dollars. So that gives you some idea of the art that they were finding. And this guy, Ma Heng, the top guy in the Palace Museum, is instrumental in setting up this museum and sort of making it work. You can see he's holding his cigar, which he loved so much. And he's wearing a Western suit and a stiff Western collar. This portrait of him was actually painted by a terribly famous Chinese artist called Xu Beihong, who was a friend of his. And by the late 1920s, you know, the museum's doing quite well and it's flourishing. But then everything changes because Japan invades. And from there, the story is just totally different.
Yeah, let's actually, I'm glad you mentioned that. This will dovetail right what I was going to ask. So Ma Heng is really central to the story. And because of the invasion of course, the Japanese Imperial Army, the decision was made to, well, move everything. How on earth do you decide what to move, how to move it? Because Ma Heng really, he didn't do it on himself. He had a lot of people helping kind of
He certainly did.
put words into how do you move this. It's very mind-boggling.
Right. So 1931, 32, the Japanese are moving on China. This is a very famous image of Chinese soldiers defending Shanghai in 1932. The Japanese attacked Shanghai in 1932. They started using aerial bombing, right? And this is really the first time that the world had ever seen aerial bombing against civilian populations. And they destroyed a huge amount of Shanghai in that time. And they also destroyed a very important museum in the center of Shanghai. So people are suddenly realizing that this new thing, air raids, aerial bombing, it's not just about killing people and blowing up buildings. It kind of destroys culture as well, right? So the curators, Ma Heng and his guys, all the curators of the Palace Museum, are sitting in the Forbidden City in Peking, and they are seeing these air raids blowing stuff up and setting Shanghai on fire. And by this time, the Japanese have come down from the north as well, and they're only about 4 hours away from Peking by road. So the curators are sitting there saying, this is horrific. What are we going to do? So they decide they have to evacuate the imperial art collections from the Forbidden City. They've got to get them out. They've got to get them to safety somewhere. How are they going to do it? And they start to pack. They know they can't pack 1.17 million pieces. So they have to select what they're going to pack. And this is one of the very few images we have of that packing process. They brought in 20,000 wooden crates, and they brought in all this cotton wadding and rice husks and thick, heavy paper and stuff like that. And they began packing this irreplaceable, invaluable art in these wooden cases. And by 1933, they had packed, 20,000 of these cases with something like, depending on how you count it, something like 250,000 pieces of art and texts and books and documents. And here you can see these wooden cases laid out in the courtyard, one of the courtyards of the Forbidden City, ready for evacuation. And in 1933, they put these cases on trains in Peking, and they take them to Shanghai. Strange choice, given that Shanghai has just been bombed by the Japanese, but that's where they thought for the time being it would be safest. And, long story short, for the next 16 years, they move these 20,000 cases packed full of art all over China. They move them the whole way to the west of China on trucks and on trains and on steamships, sometimes on rafts, bamboo rafts that they were like poling across rivers, to safety in the far west of China. They store them in caves, in temples, in little villages way out in the boonies, in ancestral halls and places where they hope the Japanese won't find them. The process of getting these cases to West China was absolutely absurd. I mean, it was crazy. You can see a map here of where they went. So here they are in Peking in 1933, then they come to Shanghai, where they stay until 1936. They move to Nanjing, and then when the all-out war starts in 1937, they go by 3 routes. Some go along the Yangtze River and then all the way down here, and they end up here at a cave in this little tiny town of Anshun, down there in Guizhou province. That takes about 1.5 years, that process. The second route that they take is by steamship. About 9,000 cases go by steamship the whole way up the Yangtze River to Wuhan, up to Yichang. Then they have to wait for months and months and months because the level of the river gets low and there are sandbars and reefs and whirlpools. And over a course of about 2 years, they end up stored just outside this town here, Leshan, in ancestral halls and temples in little quiet villages. And the third route of about 7,000 cases goes north by rail, and it goes far, 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 far across China by rail to this town here, Baoji, with the Japanese right behind it. The Japanese advance moving across China at this time. And then they have to, because the Japanese are so close, these trucks, they put them on trucks and they have to take them over the Qinling Mountains, which are 12,000 feet high. They're the highest mountains in China outside Tibet. They're on icy switchback roads in snowdrifts and whiteouts. And they come down this route here across rivers where the bridges have all been bombed. And they have to drive the trucks onto these bamboo rafts. So these are the trucks loaded with cases of irreplaceable Chinese art from sort of thousands of years old, absolutely invaluable. The trucks nose their way down to the riverbank and they nose their way onto these bamboo rafts. And then they're poled across the river by the boatmen. And it takes months to do this. It's incredibly slow. And all the time, Japanese bombers are overhead and the Japanese are bombing all over West China. And it really is an unbelievable logistical story. And the men who did it were improvising all the time. It was poorly planned. It was chaos. They never knew what the next day was going to bring. They were constantly searching for means of transport. They were searching for trucks. They were saying, they didn't have enough to eat. And they were part of this massive wave of migration that went from East China, where the Japanese invaded, the whole way across to West China. About 100 million people fled the Japanese advance. One of the largest migrations in human history. Fled from East China to West China to run away from the Japanese in the war. The government fled from the capital to West China. Factories fled, whole universities went, schools went. I mean, it was just extraordinary what took place. And the art, these 20,000 cases of art were a part of that enormous migration that went from East China to West China. And this time, if you ever encounter someone in the United States who is of Chinese extraction, who has Chinese parents or Chinese grandparents, if you ask them about this, they will have stories from their family of this time. Almost every family, American Chinese family, has these memories that their grandparents and their parents told them of this extraordinary time when they were all fleeing the Japanese. And it's worth asking, because all these stories are out there and they're sort of a part of our larger American life, but somehow we just don't hear them very much.
So it kind of sounded like, from what you're describing with the journey, it was sort of improvised. And I think I might have said this before the program. That's just mind-boggling because China's a huge nation. So were they pretty much, Ma Heng and some of his individuals at the museum, were they pretty much just trying to get as far as they could from the Japanese army and basically sit there and hope that maybe they would be kicked out of the nation or things would be better? Or was it just, well, we're here, now let's move somewhere else?
Yeah, it was I think it was kind of all of the above. In 1937, by 1937, the 20,000 cases were in Nanjing. 1937, all-out war breaks out and Japan invades in earnest. And at this point, the Japanese are moving up the Yangtze River Valley here and they're advancing on Nanjing. And the Palace Museum, Ma Heng and all his guys suddenly realize they've got to get these cases out because otherwise the Japanese are probably going to steal them, or they might get bombed, or they were terrified of air raids. And so they managed to get 17,000 cases out of Nanjing. 3,000 got stuck, got left behind. But the last of them got out from Nanjing only 10 days before the Japanese arrived and took the city. And it was total chaos. The docks in Nanjing and the railway stations were swamped with refugees. The Republican Army, the Chinese army, was frantically trying to bring war material to the front and organize a defense of Nanjing. The Japanese were bombing, their tanks were advancing, their artillery was opening fire. And these curators managed somehow to load 17,000 cases of art on railway cars and steamers and got them out at the very beginning of late November, beginning of December 1937. And this is Nanjing, right? You might have heard of what happened to Nanjing. Sometimes it's called the Rape of Nanjing. But when the Japanese took the city, it was one of the greatest atrocities of World War II. Nobody really knows how many people were slaughtered, but it was in the many tens of thousands and maybe in the hundreds of thousands. It was a massacre, and appalling crimes were committed against women in that episode. So the sort of cataclysmic nature of what was going on is really embodied and epitomized in that moment in Nanjing, where the Japanese are almost at the gates and our curators, Ma Heng and our guys, are frantically loading cases onto steamships and trains to get them out. But they didn't really know where they were going to go. They knew they were heading west, but they didn't really know where they were going to end up. So our guy, Ma Heng, um, this guy that we were just talking about, him, he's kind of going out ahead with some of his curators, and they're looking for storage places. Because wherever they go, they've got to have at least temporary storage. So they've got to find warehouses that are at least dry, and are maybe safe and aren't too kind of likely to catch fire. Then he's got to go ahead even further, and he's got to try and find some kind of permanent storage places. So he's scrambling in and out of caves all the time, looking for caves that are dry enough, looking at caves that are close to a road or a river so you can transport these 20,000 cases there. He's looking at temples in little quiet, isolated villages. He's looking at ancestral halls and things like that, that are dry, that are safe, that are separate from other buildings. So if there is a fire, it doesn't spread. And he's running all over West China, looking for places where they can store these cases. And they finally settle on these 3 locations. Let me go back to the map. Where has it gone? These 3 locations in the far west of China, here in Ermei, here just outside Leshan, and here in Anshun. But it was utterly improvisational in that way. And they, some days they didn't know one day to the next where they were actually going.
So while this was going on, believe it or not, some of these objects actually went on display to London and Russia, which I was just, my mind was blown on that because, of course, we know Japan was invading China, but these items from the imperial city went to London and Russia. Why was the decision to do this during war? And what did the population think about that? Did they think like maybe they were being sold, or maybe they would never come back? How did the average, citizen think about that?
Right. So during all this time, the Palace Museum, Ma Heng and his curators and the museum were still actually trying to function as a museum. And they would try and do exhibitions when they could, amazingly. So there were a number of exhibitions inside China during these years, but crucially, in 1935-36, they were asked to send some of their finest pieces to London for the great International Chinese Art Exhibition of 1935-36, which was a huge deal at the time. So the government of China, the government of the Republic of China, thought this would be a good idea because it would be a good sort of propaganda. It would be reminding people in Europe and the West that the Republic of China existed, that it was being invaded by Japan, and it could garner sympathy. It could remind people in Europe that China was a great civilization and that it was a place that maybe required attention and support and help, that it deserved attention and help. So they took about 1,000 of very fine pieces from the collection, and they boxed them up, and they put them on a British Navy cruiser, and it took them the whole way to London with a couple of the curators. And it stayed there for months and months and months, and then it came all the way back. And there are lovely stories associated with that time, not least that on their way back from London, the cases were on a liner of the great steamship line P&O, and they got into a terrible storm, and as they're passing Gibraltar into the Mediterranean, this huge liner, this P&O cruise liner with the cases, the art packed in the hold, runs aground in a storm, and they're stuck, and they don't know if they're going to sink or if they're going to overturn in the storm or what's going to happen to them. It's like everything that they try, everything that happens to them, everything goes wrong, and then somehow at the end they kind of get away with it. The whole story is one of near misses from start to finish. And they did the same thing with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union invited them to send pieces to an exhibition in 1940, which they did. And they sent it to Moscow. And while the pieces were in Moscow, the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union. And these pieces were stuck there with the Nazis. There's this fantastic art was stuck in Moscow with the Nazis, advancing on Moscow. So again, just over and over and over again, they get into terrible trouble, and yet somehow they get themselves out of it. The story is one of yeah, absurd near misses from start to finish.
So you touched a little bit upon this, but in China, it seemed like Ma Heng and some of the other individuals kind of wanted to keep this a secret. There was a little bit of fear of maybe we're selling it to the West or other places, but a lot of the news got out. It was really highly publicized. Is that really true? Did a lot of people think that, oh, they were moving the things, or were they just paranoid because of all these things happening that nobody will see them ever again, and they might get lost in the detritus or fog of war?
So a lot in the late 19th century and the early 20th century, a lot of art got plundered and stolen in China, and a lot just got sold to Japanese and European and American collectors. So there was always this feeling among China's kind of art historians and their intelligentsia that, you know, everybody wants our art. They're going to steal it, they're going to buy it, or someone's going to sell it and we're going to lose it. We're going to lose our national heritage. And when this took place, when the art of the imperial collections gets crated up and moved all over China, yeah, there's constant fear that actually what's happening is it's just getting stolen and it's going to get sold off. In fact, the opposite was true. Our curators, Ma Heng and the Palace Museum curators, were incredibly careful about keeping records of every single piece. And they didn't, on this trip, as far as I can tell from primary sources, they didn't lose anything. They kept track of every single piece. Quite a lot got broken, but as far as I can tell, they didn't lose anything. And after the war, you know, it made it back. It had to come the whole way back, of course, after the war, but the whole journey in reverse. But there was enormous concern all the time among Chinese people that this art was out there and it was at risk, and you know, were people simply going to steal it, because so much Chinese art had been either stolen or plundered or sold in the past. And you know, when you go to museums in America, you know, you can see the stuff that got sold, and some of it stolen and some of it plundered. It's in our museums in Europe and Paris and London and Berlin and New York and San Francisco. You know, these museums are full of art that was taken in one way or another from China. Yeah.
It's actually interesting you were going to mention that, because we were talking before that I have a museums background in museums and archives, and one of the things we learned about is, so there's the AAM, the American Association of Museums. Essentially, they have this document, if you will, that has things during World War II that were stolen, lost, or what have you, that the Nazis took. And essentially, if you're a museum, you don't want to be on that list, or you don't want to be caught dealing with that. So with that being said, is there something similar? Because you mentioned there was a lot of items that were taken during, you know, the 17, 18, 1900s by Britain or maybe the United States. Has any of that been brought to the attention of the Chinese Republic, and maybe they should get that repatriated back to China?
It's a big and very fraught issue. There are certainly pieces that the People's Republic of China thinks ought to go back. Notably stuff that was stolen from caves by Western adventurers, explorers, collectors in the early 20th century. The place that everybody always talks about is Dunhuang, which is this massive cave complex kind of up here in northwestern China, where colossal amounts of statues, Buddhist statues and friezes were ripped off the walls, and statues were hacked out of the caves and were taken back to the United States. A good deal of that is in Boston. A lot of it is in London, also in the British Museum, the British Library. And there's been certainly discussion and pressure for that stuff to go back. The trouble with a lot of this is that these museums and these collectors in Europe and the United States, often they bought it completely legitimately. This was done on the art market and they've got a receipt, you know. It's much harder to argue that that stuff should go back if Chinese dealers sold it to Western dealers who sold it to Western collectors. I think that becomes a lot more difficult to talk about. Then there's stuff that was just plundered. So for example, 1900, an allied army of European armies in the United States and Japan marches on Peking in 1900 for complicated reasons. But that army plundered Peking very badly in 1900, and huge amounts of art were stolen. And that was real looting. And a lot of that made its way back to Europe. And some of the stuff in the British Museum, for example, comes from that time. And there is a fraught discussion about what should happen to it. It hasn't got to the point yet, I don't think, that European and American governments are ready to start just giving stuff back. But I think that conversation is probably on the horizon.
So speaking of artifacts, I found it very interesting. There was an American, Horace, I think H.F. Jane, and he had a role with the saving the Chinese artifacts, and he went on to do the Monument Men, as I understand it. Can you talk a little bit about that? Maybe if there was any U.S. support for a lot of these artifacts being saved in the war?
Yeah, so he's a fascinating guy. He was indeed part of the Monuments Men story in the US. He worked for the State Department, and he helped establish the Monuments Men program to help save art from the Nazis and repatriate art stolen by the Nazis. He was an art curator from Philadelphia, and one of his specialties was Asian art. And then after the war was over, so 1945, right, Japan has surrendered. Our 20,000 wooden cases that are over here in the far west of China have to come back. They're going to come the whole way back, which they do over 2 years on ships coming up the Yangtze River. And they're back in Nanjing here by 1947. Horace Jane comes out from the United States. He's sent out by the US State Department to try and make an assessment of the damage done to Chinese culture and to Chinese heritage in the Second World War. At this time, the US was deeply engaged in China. The 2-3 years after the war, large parts of China were basically run by the United Nations and the United States. Massive US presence trying to rebuild. And Horace Jane finds himself driving around and looking at this art that's come back, and opening up these cases, and coming to realize that the imperial collections had in fact survived this extraordinary journey. And he wrote this very beautiful article, which full of kind of joyous realization that this art had survived World War II thanks to Ma Heng and his curators. And so that's a sort of lovely link between the Monuments Men program and what happened here in China, in this rather jolly, thoughtful, joyous guy, Horace Jane, who was just so incredibly happy to discover and be able to report to the US government that Ma Heng and his curators had saved the heart, the flower of the imperial collections.
So skipping ahead a little bit, after, of course, Japan capitulated at the end of World War II, that really wasn't the end of it, because then you had the fighting between the communists and, of course, Chiang Kai-shek and the Republic. So it was almost like a race to save all these objects again. Was it another case of, well, we better move it away? Where do we move it? And where did these objects kind of end up?
Right. So yeah, so 1945, we think of 1945 as the end of the war, right? Well, it kind of wasn't, actually. You can make a good argument that World War II kind of didn't end in 1945, because, especially in Asia, because the fighting continued all through Asia, but particularly in China. China falls back into civil war. The Republic of China under Chiang Kai-shek is absolutely exhausted. They fought 8 years of all-out war. Inflation is out of control. People are starving in the streets. The country is falling to bits. And up north, way up here in the Northwest, you've got the communists who've sat out the war largely up here, gaining in strength. Chairman Mao is in charge, and these guys are going to take their opportunity and they are going to move on China. They're going to move to take China. And they do. And they start moving across North China. They start controlling whole chunks of North China. And the Republic down here in South and Central China is collapsing. Chiang Kai-shek, the leader of the republic, is watching his government fall to pieces, and he realizes that he's going to lose, and he needs to retreat. He needs to go somewhere. He needs a haven that he can take himself, his family, his wealth, his government, what remains of his military. Where's he going to go? They choose to go to Taiwan, right? The Republic of China retreats to Taiwan. Chiang Kai-shek decides he's going to take with him not only the entire gold bullion reserve of China, but he decides that he's going to take the very finest pieces of the imperial art collections with him too, because this is evidence that he is actually the true leader of China. He's the true steward of Chinese culture, and he's going to take the very best art with him to demonstrate that. So late 1948, our art curators are ordered to pull out the very, very best pieces of art, to crate them up in 3,000 crates, and to ship them from Nanjing out past Shanghai, down into the East China Sea, and down to Taiwan. And they go in 3 shipments on, actually they go on, one of them anyway, goes on one of these. It's called a landing ship tank. They're actually American made and built. This one actually served at Normandy. Tanks rolled off this onto the Normandy beaches. But after the war, the Americans gave a whole load of them to the Republic of China. And they used one of these ships to load full of crates full of imperial art and sail it down to Taiwan. And so some of the very, very finest imperial art ends up in Taipei here, where it remains today. And it forms the center of the collection at the Palace Museum Taipei, which is the most fabulous museum. It's the most wonderful collection of Chinese art that you'll ever see. So today there are 2 palace museums. There's a palace museum back up here in Peking, or today we call it Beijing. And in the back, still it lives in the Forbidden City. And there is a palace museum Taipei with this big chunk of the imperial collections. So at the end of, by 1949, these 20,000 wooden cases containing this incredible art that's been through thick and thin over 16 years, with its curators looking after it every step of the way, it's split. The collection is split, it's divided. And it's been divided ever since. And the curators were split too. Some of them decided to remain behind and wait for the communist takeover, and some of them fled to Taiwan and lived out their lives on Taiwan. So this incredible imperial collection that was there in the Forbidden City for centuries and centuries has been divided and split since 1949, which is a kind of reflection of the way that the PRC has been split from the Republic of China and Taiwan. Yeah.
Okay, so I think we'll open it up to questions. So don't forget, again, there's the little Q&A button there. You can go ahead and ask. So we have a question that's asking, what drew you to this story? And can the art be viewed today, either in Taipei or in the Imperial City, and what's on display?
So what drew me to the story was quite simply, it had never been told in English. It's sort of reasonably well known about in Chinese, and there's quite a lot of good material in Chinese. But there really is very little knowledge of this story in English. There's basically 1 chapter in 1 book that was written in the mid-90s, is the only telling of it in English. So when I kind of first heard about the story, 11 years ago now, I was stunned to find that there wasn't a proper telling of it. And the more I looked around and the more I dug, I realized that very important primary source material was getting published in Chinese that was telling us giving us lots more detail about the story. And it kind of fell into my lap. You know, I was a journalist. I had spent a lot of time in China. I read Chinese, not terribly well, but I do. So I felt like I could maybe give it a go, and Fragile Cargo is the outcome of that process. The art today is on display. It's on display in the Palace Museum, Beijing, which is inside the Forbidden City, and all sorts of stuff is on display. They have to rotate it, particularly the paintings, because they can't take too much light. So it gets rotated through the storerooms and the storehouses, and the exhibition's always kind of changing. And it's also on display here at the Palace Museum Taipei, where you can see those wine jars, those bronze wine jars that date from the Han Dynasty 2,000 years ago. Those are on display in Taipei. You can see them. You can sometimes see the ewer with the copper red glaze has been on display in Taipei. These paintings you don't see so much, because every time they are exposed to the light, they degrade a little bit more. So they're kept wrapped up and they're kept in storage. But what they've done is they've taken fantastic photographs of them. And you can see those online. If you just go to the Palace Museum Taipei's website, you can download these terrific high definition photographs of everything. And they've made it all public access. So you can do whatever you want with them. You can have them, you can edit them, you can share them. And it's really wonderful. It's an absolutely fantastic resource. And it's really worth just going to their website and just browsing through some of this incredible art that's there for you to look at.
I'll have to second that, because I actually looked at that place just to kind of do my research for this, and it is wonderful to see them taking all those images of those items. But speaking of art, this is more of a comment than a question. But so we have the Cleveland Museum of Art up in Cleveland, and a director that was there from 1958 to 1983. His name was Sherman D. Lee, and he collected a huge amount of Chinese art. We have a very large Asian department there, and they actually expanded that, but he supposedly had one of the largest amounts, maybe the second amount in all of the US. That's kind of surprising to hear that, but that's a thing that we have in Cleveland. So it was interesting.
And he's one of the guys who was really foundational to the study of Chinese art history in the West. You know, before really the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, the art of China wasn't taken very seriously in Europe or the United States. These things were not really referred to as art, they were referred to as curios. Do you ever come across that word, the curio?
Yeah.
So a curio was a thing that was not quite just a knickknack or just a little object, but it also didn't rise to the level of art. And Chinese art was often just considered a collection of curios. And it was people like my guy Ma Heng, and it was people like the great American collector John C. Ferguson, and it was people like Sherman Lee that you're talking about, and other Western art historians like James Cahill, who really began the process of studying the art of China in Europe and the United States. So the field of Chinese art history in the West is actually very new. It's very recent, and it was guys like him that began it. Yeah.
So your little tidbit for the night for everybody. So you mentioned curio. That's where the term curio cabinet came from. We have those little wonderful odysseys, and people, of course, that had money would show them off to people, and that was supposedly where museums started at. But speaking of artifacts and things like that, did you travel over to maybe China or anything like Taiwan to maybe do research or see any of these artifacts?
I spent a lot of time in Taiwan. The Palace Museum in Taipei was very welcoming and very open, and they were very happy to help me do my research, and they were absolutely great. Things are trickier inside the People's Republic of China. Things are rather fraught and rather tense there right now. The atmosphere is not great. There's a lot of political, what's the word? Tightening up, clamping down. For me, it's difficult to go to China anyway, because I was a journalist there for many years. And so they're always a little bit leery of giving me a visa. So I was not able to get, and then we had a global pandemic, right? So I was not able to get into the Palace Museum Beijing. They were not really okay with the idea of my coming in to do research, but Taipei was fantastic, and I went there, and I was actually able to interview two surviving eyewitnesses to this whole story, one of whom was 100 years old at the time when I interviewed him, one of the curators who saw the art to Taiwan. incredibly generously, sat with me for an afternoon and told me everything, gave me his memories. And the son of one of the curators who went on this whole journey gave me his childhood memories of the time of living out in the far west of China during wartime, what they ate, where they slept, how they lived, what it was like, his memories of his father, the curator, how they would conserve the art over the years while they were stored out there in West China, how they would take these fabulous paintings like this one, Herd of Deer in a Maple Grove. They'd have to take them out of their cases and unroll them in order to air them, so they didn't get damp and so that mold didn't grow on them. And this wonderful old gentleman, Zhuangling, who was 87 when I interviewed him, told me wonderful, moving stories of being with his father and helping him pull the paintings out of these wooden cases and hang them up in the autumn breeze to dry and to air. And it was absolutely lovely. And it was, for me, it was a real point of contact with the story and with the people who were really there. Yeah.
So I have to ask, how is Ma Heng, how is he thought of today? Is he sort of the father of saving these objects, a really good curator? Did he leave any impact? Because a lot of these items were stored in, well, not so ideal places. Did he have any impact on museum studies, as we call it in the United States?
He did. He was instrumental in setting up both archaeology and museum studies in China, and he was instrumental in setting up the Palace Museum, which was the central cultural institution of China at the time. His scholarship is very real. He did all sorts of important archaeology, and he was also a great scholar of ancient inscriptions. His scholarship survives him, but he is best known as the guy who took these 20,000 cases on this crazy long journey. He is viewed these days as a hero, as a national hero in the People's Republic of China. His story is actually rather more complicated. The final chapter of my book, Fragile Cargo, deals with what happened to him after the communists took power. He decided to stay in China and wait for the communists. He didn't go to Taiwan. And the story of what happened to him after the communists took power is a sad one. It's not great. He ended up getting taken away and interrogated, as all the officials of the previous government had been. And he had a miserable time. And he died in the mid-1950s, sort of humiliated, and his achievements not recognized at the time. Latterly, he has been rehabilitated and is now a greatly respected figure, but he died a very unhappy and humiliated man. So the book has an ending that is not, it's not a happy ending, I'm afraid. It's a rather sad and moving story. But yeah, that's what happened to him.
So our final question tonight talks about, of course, money. How are these things financed? Was anything given over maybe by the United States or England, or was it all pretty much the Chinese Republic? Because you can't plan for anything like this. We kind of saw with your map. Where on earth are they going to get this money from? Are they going to expect people to kind of maybe donate things along the way, or is it just by the seat of your pants?
Great question. It was a constant source of stress for Ma Heng, was financing the whole thing. He had to oversee, scores of curators, 20,000 wooden cases, steamships, trucks, porters, laborers. He had to renovate and maintain all these places where the art was stored. He was constantly under financial pressure. Some of the money came from central government, from the government of the Republic, but the government was in chaos throughout the war years, so they never got enough. They got some subventions from government. One of the things that did come to their aid was something called the Boxer Indemnity Fund. This was money that the British kind of returned to China. It's a complicated story. But basically the British weighed in and helped out a bit with advances, with they were supposed to be loans. I don't think they ever got paid back. So the British helped a bit, and the British helped providing steamships to move the cases up and down the river. But that was basically the only foreign help they got. The Americans I've never seen didn't help, as far as I can tell. There was nothing came from the States. And it was a constant source of anxiety. And particularly, and this is a point I try to make in the book, from about 1941 onwards, the Republic of China under Japanese invasion was absolutely crippled by inflation. And one of the reasons that the Republic ended up disintegrating and the communists ended up taking China was simply that the economy fell apart because of inflation. So we have these documents, these reports written by Ma Heng himself, bemoaning the fact, written to his board of directors and to the central government, where he is laying out just how little money he's got and how it's being devalued week on week on week by inflation, and how his curators, who are on fixed salaries, now haven't got enough to eat. They can't even afford to buy rice and vegetables because inflation has eaten away their salaries so badly. So you get a real insight into one of the central features of this chunk of history, which was rampant inflation, through looking at Ma Heng's predicament and thinking about how they finance this story. You get great visibility on this much larger problem, which resulted in the collapse of the Republic and in the Communist Party taking China. Inflation. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for coming out to talk to us, Adam. This is a wonderful book, and like I mentioned, this did come out last week, so fragile cargo, everyone.
Thank you very much for having me. Much appreciated.
Okay, thank you, and good night, everybody. Take care.
Thanks. Good night.